Katie Morrison stood at the entrance of Galactic Academy Station and tried not to look as nervous as she felt. The massive corridor stretched ahead of her, with ceilings so high they seemed to disappear into artificial clouds. And students of dozens of species walked past her without a second glance. She was the first human to attend this school, the most prestigious educational institution in known space. And everyone kept reminding her of that fact. "You ready for this?" Danny Cooper asked from beside her. The human security officer had been assigned to help her settle in, and his presence was the only familiar thing in this alien world. "I have to be," Katie said quietly. Adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder, the station orbited in neutral space between three major galactic powers, and it accepted students from 47 different member species of the Galactic Council. Earth had only joined 3 years ago after first contact, and most species still viewed humans with curiosity mixed with caution. Danny checked his datapad and nodded toward a corridor on the left. "Your orientation starts in 20 minutes. Professor Telmark is supposed to meet you in Lecture Hall 7. They walked together through halls filled with beings that looked nothing like humans. Some floated instead of walked. Others had too many limbs or not enough. And a few were so strange that Katie couldn't figure out which end was the head. A group of tall crystalline aliens passed by, and one of them stared at Katie with what might have been contempt. His body reflected light in sharp angles, and his voice carried a musical quality when he spoke to his friends in a language Katie didn't understand. "That's Vexith," Danny said in a low voice after they passed. "His father is some big counselor. Word is he doesn't think humans belong here." "Great," Katie muttered. But she kept her face neutral and her shoulders back. The lecture hall was enormous and designed to accommodate species of vastly different sizes. Katie found a seat in the middle section, where the chairs were actually sized for beings close to her height, and she set her bag down carefully. Other students filed in slowly. Most of them gave her curious looks, but kept their distance. She was used to that by now. Professor Telmark entered through a side door, and the room fell silent. He was a Zenthari, an ancient species known for their wisdom and patience. His skin had a silver-blue hue, and his 4 eyes blinked in sequence as he surveyed the room. "Welcome to Galactic Academy," his voice was warm and carried easily through the space without any technological help. "You are the future leaders, scientists, and diplomats of your worlds. Here you will learn not just from texts and teachers, but from each other." He began explaining the Academy's structure and rules, the strict anti-violence policies, the academic standards, and the importance of cultural exchange. Katie listened carefully and took notes on her datapad. She had studied for 2 years just to qualify for admission, and she wasn't going to waste this opportunity. "We have a special addition to our student body this cycle," Professor Telmark said, and his eyes found Katie in the crowd. "Miss Morrison represents Earth, a world recently welcomed into our community. I encourage you all to approach this opportunity for learning with open minds." Several students turned to look at her, and Katie felt her cheeks warm. But she nodded politely at the professor after the orientation. Students were dismissed to find their dormitories and prepare for classes beginning the next day. Katie gathered her things and headed for the exit. "Hey, human!" A voice called out behind her. She turned to see Vexith approaching with 2 of his friends. They were all from the same crystalline species, and they moved with an arrogance that reminded Katie of certain people back home. "Yes?" she asked calmly. "I wanted to welcome you personally," Vexith said, but his tone made it clear the welcome was anything but friendly. "It must be hard being so far from your primitive little world." His friends laughed, and one of them added something in their language that made them laugh harder. Katie took a breath and kept her voice level. "Thank you for the concern, but I'm adapting just fine." She turned to leave, but Vexith stepped into her path. "I heard Earth is classified as a Class 12 Deathworld. That's supposed to be impressive, right?" It just means our planet has extreme conditions compared to most inhabited worlds, Katie said. Extreme? Vexith scoffed. You look soft and weak to me. No natural armor, no claws, not even proper scales. I think the classification system is broken. Katie could feel her jaw tighten, but she forced herself to relax. The classification isn't about how individuals look. It's about environmental factors. Sure it is, Vexith said dismissively and deliberately bumped her shoulder as he walked past. The impact was light by human standards, but clearly meant to intimidate. Katie watched him go and said nothing. Getting into a confrontation on her first day would be exactly the wrong way to represent humanity. She had been warned about this. Told that some species would test her, push her, try to see if humans were as dangerous as Earth's reputation suggested. Danny found her a few minutes later in the corridor leading to the dormitory section. How did orientation go? Fine, Katie said. Met the professor, got the rules, the usual, and Vexith? He made his opinion of humans clear, Katie admitted. But I didn't take the bait. Danny nodded approvingly. Good. That's exactly what you should do. These aliens don't understand physical conflict the way we do. Most of their species evolved on worlds where violence is rare. They think bullying is just words and minor pushing. He doesn't know what he's doing. Katie said quietly. No, Danny agreed. He really doesn't. That night in her dormitory room, Katie unpacked her few belongings and set up her small space. The room was designed to be adaptable for different species. So she had to adjust the gravity plating to Earth standard and modify the bed for human use through the window. She could see the stars, and somewhere out there was Earth. Her family, her friends, everything familiar and comfortable. But she was here now, representing all of humanity to species that have been traveling the stars for thousands of years. No pressure at all. Her datapad chimed with a message from her mother asking how the first day went. Katie typed back a cheerful response and left out the part about Vexith. No need to worry anyone back home. She lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow would be her first actual classes. Biology with Professor Telmark, physics, and galactic history. She had prepared as much as she could, but there was no way to know what to expect. The Academy's automatic lighting dimmed to simulate night, and Katie closed her eyes. Somewhere in the station, Vexith was probably laughing with his friends about the weak human who didn't fight back. Let him laugh. Katie thought he had no idea what restraint actually meant. No concept of the strength it took to walk away back on Earth. Children learned young that humans were stronger than they looked, that their bodies were built for a harsher world, that they had to be careful not to hurt others by accident. Katie had broken a boy's wrist in 3rd grade during a game of tag. She hadn't meant to, hadn't even squeezed hard. But his bones were fragile compared to hers, and the medical bills had been enormous. After that, she learned control, learned to modulate her strength, learned that being strong meant knowing when not to use that strength. Vexith would learn that lesson too, Katie suspected. But hopefully not the hard way. She drifted off to sleep thinking about home and wondering what tomorrow would bring. Biology class started at what the station designated as morning. Though in space the concept of day and night was artificial. Katie arrived early and chose a seat near the middle of the classroom where she could see the display. Screens clearly. Professor Telmark was already there, organizing his teaching materials and setting up holographic displays. He noticed Katie and gave her an encouraging nod. Other students filtered in gradually, most choosing seats away from Katie, whether from caution or simple unfamiliarity, she couldn't tell. A few brave souls sat nearby and offered tentative greetings that Katie returned with genuine smiles. Vexith entered with his usual group of friends and made a show of looking around the room before his gaze landed on Katie. He said something to his friends that made them laugh and then deliberately chose a seat directly behind. Oh, Katie felt the hair on the back of her neck prickle, but she kept her eyes forward and opened her datapad to the day's lesson. Materials. Today, we begin our study of extreme environment adaptation. Professor Telmark announced once everyone was seated. We will examine how various species evolved to survive in challenging conditions. He brought up a holographic display showing a planet with violent storms and active volcanoes. This is Krath, homeworld of the Krathians. Notice the atmospheric pressure is twice galactic standard, and the temperature fluctuates drastically. A student from the Krathian species, a stocky being with thick armored plates, raised one of her multiple limbs. Professor, our ancestors developed internal temperature regulation and pressure-resistant biology over millions of years. Excellent, Professor Telmark said. Adaptation is not instantaneous. It requires countless generations of evolutionary pressure. He cycled through several more examples, each showing worlds with various challenges. High radiation, extreme cold, thin atmospheres, and others. Then he brought up Earth. Katie felt everyone's attention shift to her as her homeworld appeared in the holographic display. Blue and green and white, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Earth is unique in that it combines multiple extreme factors, Professor Telmark explained. High gravity, aggressive weather patterns, diverse and competitive ecosystem, and significant seasonal variations. How high is the gravity? A student asked from the back. Earth's surface gravity is approximately 1.2 times galactic standard, the professor said behind Katie. Vexith made a scoffing sound. That's barely higher. Humans always exaggerate their world's dangers. Professor Telmark's eyes fixed on Vexith with a look that suggested he had dealt with difficult students before. Mr. Vexith, do you have a question or merely a commentary? Just an observation, Professor, Vexith said smoothly. Looking at Miss Morrison, I find it hard to believe she comes from such a supposedly harsh environment. Several students shifted uncomfortably, and Katie felt her hands clench under the desk. But she forced herself to breathe slowly and let it go. Appearances can be deceiving, Professor Telmark said mildly. Miss Morrison, would you care to describe a typical season on Earth? Katie hesitated, then stood as was customary when addressing the class. Well, I grew up in Colorado, which is a mountainous region. In winter, the temperature drops below freezing, and we get heavy snow. In summer, it can reach temperatures that would be dangerous for many species here. And you consider this normal? A small-furred student asked with obvious concern. Yes, Katie said. We just dress appropriately and adjust our activities. Children play outside in winter. We go hiking in summer. It's just part of life. Fascinating, Professor Telmark said. What about wildlife? We have bears, mountain lions, wolves, snakes. Various predators. Katie listed them casually. You learn to be aware of your surroundings and make noise when hiking so you don't surprise them. The classroom was silent for a moment as students processed the idea of children casually coexisting with multiple predator species. Vexith laughed loudly. Breaking the silence, next you'll tell us you swim with sea monsters. We call them sharks, Katie said evenly. And yes, people do swim in oceans where they live. Shark attacks are actually pretty rare if you follow basic safety rules. Remarkable, Professor Telmark said. This illustrates an important point about Deathworld species. What seems extreme to us is simply normal life to them. Thank you, Miss Morrison. Please be seated. Katie sat down and tried to ignore the whispers around her. She had known that her descriptions of Earth would seem shocking to aliens from gentler worlds. But hearing it out loud made her realize just how different her upbringing had been. The lesson continued with this Professor Telmark explaining them biological adaptations that allowed various species to thrive in their native environments. Katie took careful notes and answered questions when called upon. When class ended, she gathered her materials quickly. hoping to leave before Vexith could make another scene. But as she stood, her datapad slipped from her desk and clattered to the floor. She bent to pick it up and felt a deliberate shove from behind. Vexith had kicked her bag as he walked past, scattering her things across the floor. "Oops," he said without any genuine apology. "You should be more careful, human." Katie knelt and began collecting her scattered belongings. Several other students helped her, which surprised her. A small being with tentacles handed her a stylus and murmured something that might have been an apology for Vexith's behavior. "Thank you," Katie said to her helpers. Trying to smile despite her frustration, Professor Telmark had noticed the incident, but by the time he moved toward them, Katie had already gathered everything and was heading for the door. The rest of the day followed a similar pattern. In physics class, Vexith made loud comments about human intelligence. In galactic history, he questioned whether Earth had any history worth teaching. Each time Katie ignored him. Each time it got a little harder by the time evening came. She was exhausted from the constant tension. Danny found her in the station's observation deck, staring out at the stars. "Rough day?" he asked, sitting beside her. "He won't stop," Katie admitted. "Every class, every chance he gets, he makes some comment or does something to provoke me." "I know," Danny said. "I've been hearing about it. Other students are talking. Some of them think you're scared of him." "I'm not scared," Katie said. And that was true. I'm being responsible. Starting a fight would make humans look bad. It would confirm every stereotype about Deathworlders being violent. "You're right," Danny agreed. "But Katie, there's a difference between being responsible and being a doormat. If he escalates beyond words, you have the right to defend yourself." "It won't come to that," Katie said. "He's just a bully." "Bullies lose interest when they don't get a reaction." Danny looked doubtful but didn't argue. "Just remember, the Academy has rules about harassment too. You don't have to handle this alone." That night, Katie lay in bed thinking about home again. About her friends who understood her strength. About playing sports where everyone knew to be careful. About a world where she fit in here. She was an outsider trying to prove that humans could be peaceful, that they could control themselves, that they deserved their place among the stars. Vexith didn't understand what he was pushing against. Didn't realize that every human child learned the weight of their own strength. Didn't know that Katie could break him without even meaning to, but she wouldn't. Because that wasn't who she wanted to be. That wasn't who humanity needed her to be. Tomorrow was another day. More classes, more chances for Vexith to test her patience. She would endure it because that's what representatives did. They endured and stayed calm and proved the doubters wrong through the window. Earth was invisible among the billions of stars. But Katie knew it was out there, her home, her family. Everything she was representing, she wouldn't let them down, no matter how hard Vexith pushed. The harassment continued for 3 more days. Each incident small enough that Katie could technically ignore it, but large enough that it wore on her patience, like water dripping on stone. Vexith seemed to take her silence as permission to escalate. On the 4th day, advanced physics class was scheduled. Katie had been looking forward to this lesson because Professor Telmark was covering gravity variations across different homeworlds. It was material she actually found interesting. She arrived early as usual and took her seat, pulling up the lesson materials on her datapad while other students filed in around her. Vexith arrived with his friends, and this time, they didn't just sit behind her. They surrounded her, taking the seats on either side and behind. Boxing her in with their presence, Katie felt her muscles tense, but she kept her eyes on her datapad and tried to focus on the upcoming lesson. Professor Telmark began his lecture by bringing up gravitational measurements from various worlds. Gravity is one of the most fundamental forces affecting biological development, he explained. Species evolving on high-gravity worlds develop denser bones, stronger muscles, and cardiovascular systems built to work harder. He showed examples of beings from heavy worlds. They tended to be shorter and more compact than species from lighter environments. Earth falls into the higher end of inhabited world gravity. Professor Telmark continued. At 1.2 times standard, humans have adapted accordingly. 1.2, Vexith said loudly enough for the class to hear. Barely above average, and they act like they're from a heavy world. Typical human exaggeration. Several students looked uncomfortable at the open disrespect. Professor Telmark frowned, but continued with his lesson. Mr. Vexith, if you have questions, please raise your hand. I don't have questions, Professor, Vexith said. Just observations about how humans overstate everything about their planet? Katie's hands gripped the edge of her desk hard, enough that her knuckles went white. But she kept staring forward and said nothing. The lesson moved on to discuss how gravity affected architecture, technology, and space travel. Katie tried to focus, but she could feel Vexith's presence behind her like a physical weight. Halfway through class, Professor Telmark asked students to calculate gravitational force differences between their homeworlds and the station. It required using their datapads and working through equations. Katie bent over her work, inputting numbers and checking her calculations. She was so focused that she didn't notice Vexith leaning forward until it was too late. He made a comment to his friend in their musical language, and they both laughed. Then he reached out and deliberately flicked the back of Katie's head. It was a small thing, barely contact at all. But it was the final straw. Katie turned slowly in her seat and looked at him directly for the first time since this started. Don't touch me, she said quietly. Or what? Vexith challenged, his crystalline features reflecting the classroom lights. What will the soft little human do? I'm asking you nicely, Katie said, her voice still calm but with an edge that hadn't been there before. Don't touch me. Vexith stood up from his seat. He was taller than Katie even when she was standing, and he looked down at her with obvious contempt. I'll do what I want. This is my academy. My people have been in space for 10,000 years, while yours were still living in caves. Professor Telmark was moving toward them now. Mr. Vexith, sit down immediately. But Vexith wasn't done. Emboldened by days of Katie's non-response, he reached out and shoved her hard in the back with both hands by Krill standards. It was a significant push meant to send her sprawling forward into her desk, meant to humiliate her in front of everyone, meant to prove that humans were weak and didn't belong here. Katie barely moved forward an inch. The classroom went completely silent. Vexith's confident expression flickered with confusion. He had put real force into that push, and she had hardly budged. It was like pushing against a wall. Katie turned around slowly and stood up. She was a full head shorter than Vexith, but somehow she seemed to fill more space than he did. I asked you nicely, she said, her voice still quiet, but now everyone could hear the controlled anger underneath. I walked away. I ignored you. I gave you every chance to stop. You don't scare me, Vexith said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. Katie's hand moved faster than anyone in the room could properly track. One moment, it was at her side. The next, it was wrapped around Vexith's wrist in an iron grip. Vexith tried to pull away immediately and couldn't. He pulled harder and Katie's hand didn't budge a millimeter. His eyes widened as he realized something was very wrong. Let me go, he demanded. Pulling with both hands now against her single grip, Katie held on for exactly 10 seconds. During those 10 seconds, Vexith learned several important lessons about humans in the first 2 seconds. He realized with growing horror that her grip was unbreakable. He was using all his strength, and she was holding him with what seemed like casual effort in the next 2 seconds. He felt the density of her bones through her skin. They felt like stone wrapped in flesh. Far denser and stronger than they had any right to be. Katie leaned in close and spoke quietly enough that only Vexith and the students nearest them could hear. Where I come from, You learn to control your strength when you're 5 years old. Because if you don't, you hurt people by accident. Every human child learns this. We learn to be gentle because we have to be. In the next 2 seconds, she continued. That 1.2 gravity is the average across Earth's surface. I grew up in mountains at high altitude where effective gravity is 1.5 times standard. My bones are denser than yours. My muscles are stronger. My reaction time is faster. Vexith had stopped struggling, his face showing fear now instead of contempt. I have been holding back since the moment I met you, Katie said. Every time you pushed me, every time you mocked me, every time you touched me, I could have ended this. But I didn't because I'm trying to show that humans can be peaceful in the final 2 seconds. Katie released his wrist and gave him a gentle push. By human standards, it was barely any force at all. Just enough to create some distance. Vexith stumbled backward 3 full meters and crashed into his desk, which slid back another meter from the impact. He caught himself on the desk and stood there clutching his wrist. The entire class stared in shocked silence. Even Professor Telmark had frozen halfway to them. Katie turned back to her desk and sat down calmly. I'm sorry for the disruption, Professor. It won't happen again. Her hands were shaking slightly as she picked up her stylus, but her face remained calm. Vexith looked down at his wrist and saw it was already swelling. The pain was starting to register now that the shock was wearing off. He had felt something give way when she gripped him. Something that wasn't supposed to bend or break, Mr. Vexith. Go to the medical bay immediately, Professor Telmark said quietly. His voice had lost all its usual warmth. Professor. Vexith started. Now, the professor said firmly. 2 of Vexith's friends helped him toward the door. He was cradling his injured wrist and looking back at Katie with an expression of shock, mixed with something that might have been fear after they left. Professor Telmark stood at the front of the class and took a moment to compose himself. Let this be a lesson about assumptions, he finally said. We cannot judge a species by appearance alone. Deathworld classifications exist for reasons that go far deeper than simple numbers. Katie kept her eyes on her datapad, trying to ignore the stares from every direction. Miss Morrison, please remain after class, Professor Telmark added. The rest of the lesson passed in a blur. Students kept glancing at Katie, but no one spoke to her. When the class ended, everyone filed out quickly, leaving her alone with the professor. Walk with me, Professor Telmark said. Not unkindly, they left the classroom and walked slowly down one of the station's quieter corridors. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Did I hurt him badly? Katie finally asked. The medical bay will assess the damage, Professor Telmark said. But yes, I believe you did. I didn't mean to, Katie said. I just grabbed his wrist. I didn't think. You didn't think your normal grip would fracture his bones. The professor finished, because to you, that was normal grip strength. Katie nodded miserably. You showed remarkable restraint, Professor Telmark said. Surprising her, Mr. Vexith has been harassing you for days. I noticed, as did other faculty. We were monitoring the situation. Then why didn't you stop him? Katie asked. Because we needed to see how you would handle it, the professor admitted. We needed to know if humans could control themselves under provocation. Katie felt a flash of anger. So I was a test? You were a question, Professor Telmark corrected gently. And you provided an answer. You endured harassment. You showed patience. And when you finally responded, you used the minimum force necessary to end the situation. They reached the observation deck and looked out at the stars together. What happens now? Katie asked. Now we all learn, Professor Telmark said. Vexith learns about consequences. The other students learn about Deathworlders. And you learn that representing your species doesn't mean accepting abuse. Katie thought about that as they stood in silence, watching the stars drift by. The medical bay was bright and sterile, filled with equipment designed to treat dozens of different species. Healer Korvax, a gentle Minthrian with soft purple skin and 6 delicate arms, examined Vexith's wrist with careful precision. 3 hairline fractures, the healer announced, running a scanner over the injury. The bone structure shows compression damage consistent with significant gripping force. What happened? Vexith hesitated, his pride warring with the throbbing pain in his wrist. I fell, he said finally. Caught my wrist wrong. Healer Korvax's large eyes blinked slowly as she looked at the scan results. Then at Vexith. This injury pattern shows 5 distinct pressure points matching finger placement. You didn't fall, someone grabbed you. Does it matter? Vexith asked defensively. It matters because I need to treat you properly, and because the station has rules about violence, the healer said, beginning to apply a regenerative cast that would speed healing. But I won't force you to report anything. Just know that whoever did this was either very angry or didn't know their own strength. After Vexith left the medical bay with his wrist bound, he found his friends waiting in the corridor. They looked at him with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Was it really the human? One asked, "She barely touched me," Vexith said bitterly. "Just grab my wrist for a few seconds." His friends exchanged glances. They had all seen Katie. She was small and soft-looking compared to most species at the academy. The idea that she could fracture krill bones with a casual grip seemed impossible. Meanwhile, Danny Cooper was reviewing security footage in his office. He had been alerted to an incident in Professor Telmark's class and wanted to see what happened before filing his report. He watched the recording and winced when Katie grabbed Vexith's wrist. He had seen that look on her face before. The careful control of someone who knew exactly how strong they were and was trying desperately not to cause damage. She held back, he muttered to himself, rewinding the footage to watch Katie's push at the end. She pushed him like he was made of glass. There was a knock on his door and Professor Telmark entered. "I assume you've seen the recording?" "Just finished watching it," Danny said. Vexith pushed her first. "Clear provocation after days of harassment." "I know," the professor said, settling into a chair. "I've been documenting his behavior all week. The question is what we do now." "Katie has the right to defend herself," Danny said firmly. "Human or not, she didn't start this." "I agree," Professor Telmark said. "But this incident reveals a larger issue. Our students don't understand what Deathworld classifications actually mean. They see the numbers and think they comprehend the reality. But they don't." Danny leaned back in his chair. "What are you thinking?" "I think it's time for an educational intervention," the professor said. "With your permission, I'd like to use this incident as a teaching moment." The next day, Professor Telmark called both Katie and Vexith to his office. The space was filled with books and artifacts from a dozen worlds. Creating an atmosphere of accumulated knowledge, Katie arrived first and sat nervously in one of the visitor chairs. She had barely slept, replaying the incident over and over in her mind. Vexith arrived a few minutes later, his wrist still wrapped in the regenerative cast. He avoided looking at Katie as he took a seat on the opposite side of the room. Professor Telmark settled behind his desk and looked at both students with his 4 eyes. "I've reviewed the security footage multiple times," he began. "Mr. Vexith, you deliberately struck Miss Morrison after days of harassment." Vexith started to protest, but the professor held up one hand. "The recording is clear. You pushed her with both hands, using what would be considered significant force by your species standards." He turned to Katie. "Miss Morrison, you responded by restraining Mr. Vexith and causing injury. While I understand it was not intentional, the result is the same." "I'm sorry," Katie said quietly. "I didn't mean to hurt him." "I know," Professor Telmark said. "And that's precisely the problem. You didn't mean to hurt him. You were actually trying not to hurt him, and you still caused fractures." He brought up a holographic display showing comparative biology data. I want both of you to understand something fundamental about Deathworld species. Mr. Vexith, what do you know about human biology? They're soft, no armor, no natural weapons, Vexith said. Still sullen, superficially correct, the professor agreed. But that analysis misses the crucial details. Let me show you. The holographic display changed to show skeletal comparisons. Human bones have approximately 3 times the density of krill bones. Their muscles attach to their skeleton in ways that maximize leverage. Their cardiovascular system is built to function under higher pressure. He brought up more data. Human grip strength, even in a child, averages 8 times stronger than species of similar mass. Their reaction time is twice as fast as most spacefaring species. They can track objects moving at speeds that would be a blur to you. Vexith stared at the display with growing unease. Earth's classification as a Class 12 Deathworld isn't just about gravity. Professor Telmark continued. It's about the compound effects of multiple extreme factors. Humans evolved alongside predators that could kill them instantly. They developed persistence hunting techniques that required running prey to exhaustion. They learned to survive weather that would shut down settlements on most civilized worlds. The professor pulled up footage of Earth, showing storms, predators, extreme environments. This is a human child playing in what they call rain, he said, showing a video of a young human running through a downpour that would be classified as severe weather on most worlds. This is a group of humans engaging in recreational activity, he showed. Footage of a football game with players colliding at high speeds. Every impact you see there would hospitalize most species in this academy. Humans do this for fun. Vexith's crystalline features seemed to pale as he watched. Miss Morrison grew up in a mountainous region with high altitude. The professor said, the effect of gravity there is even higher than Earth's average. She learned to control her strength because human children regularly injure each other by accident if they don't. He turned to Katie. How old were you when you first hurt someone unintentionally? 8, Katie said quietly. I was playing tag and grabbed another kid's arm too hard. He had bruises for weeks. And you learned from that experience? I learned to be gentle, Katie said. To pull my punches, to measure my strength. Every human kid learns this. Professor Telmark nodded. That's what makes Deathworld species so remarkable. It's not just that they're strong or fast or resilient. It's that they learn control from childhood. They live every day knowing they could hurt others and choosing not to. He looked at Vexith directly. When you pushed Miss Morrison, you used what was significant force by your standards. By your standards, you barely touched her. When she grabbed your wrist, she was trying to be gentle, trying not to hurt you. And she still caused fractures. The silence in the room was heavy. What you need to understand, Mr. Vexith, is that Miss Morrison has been holding back since the moment she arrived at this academy, the professor said. Every handshake, every time she moves through a crowd, every interaction with species more fragile than herself, she is constantly moderating her strength. He pulled up more comparative data. A full-force punch from Miss Morrison would likely be fatal to you. Her running speed would let her outpace most species here. Her endurance would allow her to continue physical activity long after others collapsed from exhaustion. I didn't know, Vexith said. His voice small. That's the point, Professor Telmark said. You made assumptions based on appearance. You saw soft skin and no visible weapons and assumed weakness. That's a dangerous mistake that could have ended much worse. He turned to Katie. You exercise remarkable restraint, and I'm proud of you for that. But you also need to learn that representing your species doesn't mean accepting abuse. There's a difference between patience and being a victim. I understand, Katie said. Do you? The professor asked, because from where I sit, You allowed days of harassment to continue when you had every right to report it, or defend yourself sooner. Katie looked down at her hands. I didn't want anyone to think humans were violent, and instead they thought you were weak, Professor Telmark said gently. Both extremes are false. Humans are capable of violence, yes, but they're also capable of choosing peace. That choice is what matters. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the stars. This academy is about learning to coexist with beings vastly different from ourselves. Both of you failed at that this week. He turned back to face them. Mr. Vexith, you will write a formal apology to Miss Morrison and present it to the class. You will also attend a seminar on Deathworld species biology. Miss Morrison, you will participate in a demonstration for the Academy about human capabilities so that other students can learn from this incident. Both students nodded their agreement. You're dismissed, Professor Telmark said, but remember, we're all here to learn. Sometimes the best lessons are the hardest ones. 2 days later, Professor Telmark's biology class assembled with an unusual tension in the air. Everyone knew what was coming, because word had spread through the station about what happened. About the human girl who fractured krill bones with a casual grip. Katie sat in her usual seat and tried to appear calm while her stomach churned with nervousness. She had spent the previous evening preparing for what would happen today. Vexith entered the classroom with his friends. His wrist still wrapped, though the regenerative cast was smaller now. He walked directly to the front of the room instead of taking his seat. Professor Telmark nodded to him. Mr. Vexith, you have something to say to the class? Vexith faced the assembled students, and his crystalline features reflected the classroom lights as he spoke. I owe Miss Morrison an apology, he began, his voice lacking its usual arrogance. I harassed her for days, made assumptions about her and her species based on ignorance. And then I physically struck her. He looked directly at Katie. I'm sorry, what I did was wrong. I judged you by your appearance and decided you were weak. I was completely mistaken. The classroom was silent as Vexith continued. I pushed you expecting you to fall, expecting to humiliate you. Instead, I learned that everything I thought I knew about humans was wrong. He held up his wrapped wrist. This injury is my own fault. You asked me to stop. You gave me multiple chances to leave you alone. I didn't listen because I assumed I was superior. I was wrong about that too. Katie stood and walked to the front of the room. She extended her hand toward Vexith in the human gesture of reconciliation. Then remembered he might be nervous about her grip and started to lower it. Vexith surprised her by reaching out and clasping her hand carefully. Thank you, he said quietly, for holding back. Thank you for apologizing. Katie replied. They returned to their seats and Professor Telmark addressed the class. This incident has revealed a significant gap in our collective understanding of Deathworld species. Today we're going to remedy that with Miss Morrison's help. He gestured for Katie to come forward again, and she did. Feeling dozens of eyes on her, Miss Morrison has agreed to answer questions and participate in a demonstration. The professor said, I encourage you all to ask what you're genuinely curious about. This is a learning environment. A small furred student raised her paw tentatively. Is it true that Earth has predators that hunt humans? Yes, Katie said. We're not apex predators on our world. There are animals that can and do kill humans, bears, large cats, crocodiles, sharks, many others. And humans just live alongside these creatures? Another student asked with obvious disbelief. We learn to coexist, Katie explained. We understand their territories and behaviors. We take precautions. Most attacks happen when humans are careless or unlucky. A tall student from a water world spoke up. I heard you say humans swim in oceans with sharks. That seems impossibly dangerous. Katie smiled slightly. Sharks usually don't want to eat humans. We're not their natural prey. Attacks are mostly cases of mistaken identity. Millions of humans swim in oceans every year, and shark attacks are statistically very rare. But they could kill you? The student pressed. Yes, Katie admitted. But we do lots of things that could kill us. We climb mountains, we explore caves. We go into wilderness areas with dangerous animals. It's part of being human. Professor Telmark brought up a holographic display showing human athletic activities. I want you all to watch this footage and understand what you're seeing. This is human children playing what they call soccer. The footage showed kids running at speeds that made several students gasp, colliding with each other, falling and getting back up, all while chasing a ball. Notice their speed, their endurance, their resilience, the professor narrated. What they're doing casually would require serious training for most species here. He changed the footage to show other human activities. Rock climbing, swimming, running long distances. Humans are persistent predators. Their ancestors would chase prey animals for hours until the prey collapsed from exhaustion. A student raised multiple limbs in question. Hours? Without stopping? Human endurance is remarkable, Professor Telmark confirmed. Miss Morrison, what's the longest you've run continuously? I did a half marathon once, Katie said. That's 21 kilometers. Took me about 2 hours. The class erupted in whispers. For most species there, running continuously for 2 hours would be impossible. Can you show us? A brave student asked. Your strength, I mean. We've heard about it, but it's hard to believe. Katie looked at Professor Telmark, who nodded his approval. We have some demonstration equipment, Miss Morrison, if you're comfortable. Katie walked to where the professor had set up various objects. Weights designed for different species to test their strength capabilities. She picked up one marked for species twice her size and lifted it easily with one hand. Students murmured in amazement as she switched hands, holding the weight steady without visible effort. This is approximately 40 kilograms, Professor Telmark said. Most species your size would struggle with half that weight. Katie set it down gently. I'm not even particularly strong by human standards, she said. I know people back home who could lift twice this much. She moved to a different demonstration. Professor Telmark had set up a pressure sensor. Place your hand on the sensor and grip as hard as you're comfortable. He instructed. Katie put her hand on the sensor and squeezed gently. The reading climbed quickly, and several students gasped at the numbers. That's enough, the professor said. You're already at levels that would damage most species' hands. I'm barely squeezing, Katie said. Releasing the sensor, Professor Telmark brought up comparative data. To put this in perspective, Miss Morrison's casual grip is stronger than the maximum grip of 63% of species represented in this academy. The room fell silent as students processed that information. A krill student, one of Vexith's friends, spoke up hesitantly. Why don't humans conquer other species? If you're this strong, why be peaceful? Katie thought carefully about how to answer. Strength doesn't equal right, she said finally. Yes, humans could probably win a lot of fights, but what would be the point? We'd rather make friends than enemies, rather learn from others than dominate them, she continued. Besides, we're strong, but we're not invincible. Other species have advantages we don't have. You're faster in water. Some of you can fly. Others can survive in environments that would kill us. Strength isn't everything, but you could hurt us so easily. The student persisted, which is exactly why we don't, Katie said firmly. Every human learns from childhood that we have to be careful. We have to control ourselves. Choosing not to use our strength is what makes us civilized. Vexith spoke up from his seat. I didn't understand that before. I thought holding back meant you were weak. Now, I realize it means you're strong enough to choose restraint. Katie nodded at him. Exactly. Professor Telmark brought the demonstration to a close. What we've learned today is that assumptions are dangerous. Miss Morrison looks soft and vulnerable compared to many species. But she comes from a world that forged her into something remarkably strong and resilient. He looked around at his students. This is why we study together, why we learn from each other. Every species has adaptations and capabilities that might not be obvious. Respect must be based on understanding, not appearance, over the following weeks. The dynamic at the academy shifted noticeably. Students approached Katie with genuine curiosity instead of caution. They asked about Earth, about human culture, about what it was like growing up on such a harsh world. Vexith became an unexpected ally. He joined Katie's study group and proved to be brilliant at mathematics and physics. Their biology project together examined the differences between high gravity and low gravity species adaptations one evening. They were working late in the library when Vexith asked, "Do you forgive me for how I treated you?" Katie looked up from her datapad. "I forgave you when you apologized," she said. "Holding grudges takes too much energy. Why were you so patient with me?" Vexith asked, "You could have reported me, could have defended yourself sooner. Why didn't you?" Katie considered the question. "Because I was scared," she admitted. "Scared that if I showed my strength, everyone would think humans were violent. Scared I'd prove all the stereotypes right. That's a heavy burden," Vexith said quietly. "It is," Katie agreed. "But Professor Telmark taught me something important. Being strong and being peaceful aren't opposites. I can be both." They worked in comfortable silence for a while. Then Vexith said, "I'm glad you're here. At the academy, I've learned more from knowing you than from a dozen classes." Katie smiled. "I've learned a lot too, mostly that I don't have to be perfect to represent humanity. I just have to be honest." 3 months later, during the Academy's Cultural Celebration Day, Katie gave a presentation about Earth that drew the largest crowd of any student presentation. She showed images of her home, talked about human history, and answered hundreds of questions. When someone asked if she missed Earth, she said yes. But she also valued what she was learning here. When another student asked if she regretted coming to the Academy, she looked at Vexith in the crowd and smiled. "No," she said. "This is exactly where I'm supposed to be, Professor." Telmark watched from the back of the auditorium and made a note in his personal journal.